Okay, we're going to give people just a few more minutes to check in, but I wanted to go ahead and welcome you to this month's edition of the parent trainings for Knox County Schools and the Parent Advisory Council. We are very happy you are here, and we're going to give people about another minute to go ahead and check in, and then we'll start our training. Okay, we're right at the 12 o'clock mark, so I wanted to go ahead and introduce our speaker. Our speaker is from Tennessee Voices, and her name is Sabrina Moore, and she is coming to talk to us today a little bit about the family-driven IEP. She's going to talk for somewhere around 45 minutes, and then she's going to be taking questions. All of your microphones and cameras are off right now. I'd appreciate if you left it that way. We have a large group of people that are coming, so you can definitely react to things she's talking about, and you can also send your questions in the chat box. And I want to respect everybody's time. So, Sabrina, we're ready for you to start. Thank you, ma'am.
Okay, perfect. Thank you guys so much for having me today. Well, like she said, my name is Sabrina Moore. I am an outreach specialist with the statewide family support network with Tennessee Voices. And I know that's a mouthful. I promise I'll put my information in the chat box for you guys to communicate with me after this training is over. Just to give you a little information about myself, I am a mom of two boys. When I was 4 months pregnant with my biological child, I opened my home to my nephew, who was 5 months old at the time and had came to us as a kinship placement through DCS. So within the first year, I had two babies and had no idea what to do with myself. To be quite honest with you, it was a very new and trying experience for us. When my son was 2 years old, we were able to adopt him. My son has been diagnosed with several mental health diagnoses ranging from disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, or commonly known as DMDD, anxiety, depression, ADHD, and at age 14, most recently, he was diagnosed with autism, which did not come as a shock to me by no means, but it did help piece together those puzzle pieces for us, and allowed us to become better advocates for him. So as we go through this training, please know that I am very knowledgeable and about the IEP world, having that lived experience. And I can empathize with not understanding what to ask for, what they're talking about. It is very trying and it's very frustrating. So, as today, as we progress into this training, I hope that I can empower you guys moving forward, and give you a positive outlook when it comes to your next meeting with the school system. And please know that, yes, we do have a large number who may be joining us today. If we could hold as many questions as possible until the end of the course, I will do my best to make certain that I'm monitoring the chats, but I may slip. Please forgive me. But now I'd like to introduce you to the Family Driven IEP. So, some takeaways about the family driven IEP are the basics of special education laws and the policies pertaining to the IEP and the 504, ideas on how to apply and promote a family driven approach with family involvement during the evaluation, the development of the IEP, and also the implementation of the IEP, and also resources to use in the future to explain roles and allow success for families at the most as the most important person in your child's IEP team. So, how do we all ensure that IEPs and 504 plan processes are family driven? And what does that really mean? And what does that really look like? So, family driven means that families have a primary decision making role in the care of their own child, as well as the policies and procedures that govern the care of all children in the community, state, tribe, territory, and nation. Family driven can include choosing supports, services, and providers, setting goals, designing and implementing programs, monitoring outcomes, parenting and funding decision making, and determining if the effectiveness of the efforts are effective. So, what are some guiding principles? For example, families and youth are more organized. Family and youth providers and administrators really embrace that concept of sharing decision making and the responsibility. Communities embrace, value, celebrate diverse cultures, and administrators allocate staff training, supports, and resources as well. In a family driven program, you should see the families and youth's experiences and their visions and their goals. Their perceptions of what their strengths and needs are really helps to guide and allows them to be comfortable with with steering that decision making. You should also see administrators and staff advocating and demonstrating their partnership with the families and the youth. You will also see funding mechanisms allowing families and youth to have a choice. And also remember, all children, youth, and families have a biological, adoptive, fostered, or surrogate family voice advocating on their behalf. So let's start at the beginning with some basics. The special education is driven and mandated by federal law. The state law adds to the interpretation of how these laws are implemented. This implementation is carried out at the school level within the capacity of the school's understanding. Now, each state must at least implement the federal requirements within the state special education laws. So the bottom line is that the state and federal laws, schools must provide special help to eligible students, eligible children, and youth. So let's talk about the IDEA. So the IDEA, or Individuals with Disability Education Act, is a federal law that governs state and laws for special education, funding and regulations regarding specialized education at a federal level are through the IDEA. Originally, IDEA was enacted in Congress back in 1975. This ensured that children with disabilities had an opportunity to receive a free, appropriate public education. Now, that's something I want you to remember. It's good for you to memorize that portion. We will be coming back to it a little bit later. Now, in January 1st of 2005, the Individuals with Disability Act of 2004, or IDEA of 2004, went into effect. This reauthorization included new requirements for special education teachers, IEPs, and scientifically based instructions for children with disabilities. So the IDEA is broken up into four parts. Part A is general provisions. Part B is assistance for education of all children with disabilities. Part C is going to be your infants and toddlers with disabilities. And Part D is going to be your national activities to improve education of children and with disabilities. There are many approaches that can be used in special education, such as special instructions, for instance, putting a child in a specialized class for all day or a part of the day, also an aid or other support services, accommodations, modifications to the child's programs may be needed. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that some parents sometimes believe that the best thing for their child is to have a one-on-one aide. That's not always the case and can really cause problems with that least restricted environment. An aide can actually make things more restricted. And we're going to talk about what least restricted environment is in the next slide. So, once again, one of my favorite terms to remind parents to remember is FAPE, or free appropriate public education. I tell my parents all the time, your child has the right to free appropriate public education in the least restricted environment possible. Now, LRE, or least restricted environment, is the fundamental concept of IDEA. It means that children with disabilities should be educated with children who are non-disabled to the maximum extent appropriate. Special classes or separate schooling should only occur if the nature or the severity of the disability is such that education in a regular classroom cannot be achieved satisfactorily. Okay, so that's very important to remember. Now, there are 10 steps to receiving special education and related services. Number one, the child or youth has to be identified as possibly needing special education or related services. Number two is going to be the child needs to be evaluated. Number three is the eligibility is then decided. At that point, the child or youth is found eligible for services. Then an IEP, or an individualized educational planning meeting, is then scheduled. From there, an IEP meeting is held and the IEP is written. After the IEP is written, services are then provided. Then we go through the process of measuring and reporting back to the parents. Then the IEP is reviewed, and then the child is reevaluated. And this is the constant cycle that we see when it comes to an IEP from the start to the end. Now, an individualized education plan, or IEP team, must meet to write an IEP. The IEP is a written contract that will drive, measure, and monitor all educational services for a child. During the evaluation process, the family or a member of the school may request for an evaluation to be done. So it can be a teacher or it can be a family member. It doesn't have to be just the parent. It can be a teacher. Now, an evaluation must be completed in order to obtain IEP services, which is very important. Now, the school must obtain written permission from the parents or the caregivers in order to start that first evaluation. The evaluation includes information from family providers. It can be from the family, it can be the team itself, people who have been working with the child, who know the child, staffing, interviews with the families. All of those things are going to be part of that evaluation process. You'll see a lot of times they're going to ask for medical records, medical concerns. That's all important also. Now, the evaluation must be completed by a trained and knowledgeable person, includes all areas related to the specific area of the disability, include more than just one test or one assessment to be provided. It also must test a child in their native language unless it clearly is not possible, and no child should be discriminated against for their race or their culture. So let's talk a minute about the determination of eligibility. The results from the evaluation will really help to decide if that student needs special education services, and it will also help to show what types of services there may be needed for that particular individual. If a family disagrees with the results of the school's decision regarding the services, the family can actually ask for a different type of evaluation to be completed. This evaluation is called an independent educational evaluation. or an IEE for short. Now, the school system can pay for this evaluation and it can be requested once per year. Now, one thing I'd like to remind parents is always make sure that you are requesting all of your evaluations and concerns in writing. Email is going to be your best friend when it comes to making certain that everyone is on the same page. Now, a number of people should be in an IEP meeting. The IEP team is a group of people. This is going to be the family, so the parent or caregiver, a significant other. It's going to be the child if age appropriate. I've seen 8-year-olds, I've seen 5-year-olds in their own IEP meetings. And then I've seen where it hasn't been appropriate for a 13-year-old to be in their IEP meeting. So it really depends on the team and the parent's perspective on if it would be appropriate for that child to be in meetings. They really do urge and want the children to be in their meetings as of age 13. Also, you're going to see a general education teacher there. You're going to see a special education teacher there or a special education provider of some sorts. You're also going to see a person from the school district who is qualified to provide and oversee special education. So that's going to be your principal, vice principal. You're also going to have someone who understands what the evaluations mean and can talk about them. It's very important to be able to have those direct conversations on what those testings were, what the outcomes were, and any questions that the parents may have. You really want to make certain that you're getting them that information and being able to provide them with that knowledge. You may also see other people from the school district involved. Sometimes there's a special education director, sometimes there's a counselor involved. So it just really kind of depends. But you should always be aware of who is going to be in those meetings. Also, families are welcome to bring their own supports as well. So that could be a certain friend, that could be a family member, that could be an advocate, that could be providers of resources, that could be mental health providers. There is a long list that could be helpful and beneficial to the team to have there. So we have seen many a times where there are providers of different services in IEP meetings, and it only makes that IEP meeting stronger. Now, one thing I do suggest to families is to make certain that you are letting the school know that certain people are coming and what their role is going to be to support in the IEP meeting, because we want to be as accommodating as possible. They're going to want to make certain that they have enough room for chairs and those sorts of things. If they need accommodations for phone conferences or for virtual attendance, they'll want to make certain that they're able to provide those as well. So by having that open line of communication is going to be very beneficial to those at the school system. So what happens after you have completed the evaluation process? You've assembled your team and your child has been determined that they do qualify for special education services. Well, that's where we develop that plan of action. And that's going to be called an individualized education plan, or an IEP for short. All students who receive special education services must have an IEP. The IEP is a plan that will outline what services the child or youth will need in the school to meet educational goals. To do this, the school must set up a meeting to discuss the results of the evaluation and to develop a plan on how special services should be used to assist those children or the youth learn. Now, the IEP cannot be written before the team meets, and it needs to include the following: a statement of the student's current level of educational performance, annual educational goals, short-term objectives to help them reach those goals, a description on services being provided, information on where these services will be provided, an example explanation, sorry, I can't talk today, an explanation concerning how, when, and where the students will participate in regular education programs, the date in which those services will begin, the way it will be determined if the goal has been accomplished, what types of data will be collected, how it will be measured, what that looks like. That will all be in that IEP. Now, an IEP has goals and objectives that are long term and written to detail a specific time frame that is desired for a change. Each goal will have 5 parts. Will do what? Now, this is the observation of the behavior describing what the child will do to complete the goal, to what level or degree. Now, this is related to the mastery of a goal and the criteria of a goal. So the criteria is going to state how many times the behavior must be observed for the goal to be considered mastery. And the mastery states the level of achieving, how many times it's required. Now, under what circumstances? Now, this is going to be important. This is going to be describing the situation, the setting, or given materials that will be needed in order to be in place for that goal to be completed. And of course, then we've got our timeline. What length of time? That's going to be the time frame in which the goal is to be completed. And number 5 is going to be how will progress be measured. Now that a team has been identified, your goals have been identified, you really want to move into developing those objectives. Now, the objective states how this will be accomplished, and it also measures the progress of, of the success. Also, within an IEP, the team will determine the related services the child and youth will need in order to benefit from special education and increase the chances of reaching those goals identified by that team. Now, the team will also discuss and identify any accommodations for the child. Accommodations are going to be changes that help a student overcome or work around the disability. That can be, for instance, avoidance forming. I'm so sorry. I believe there is somebody unmuted. If you could please mute. Thank you. So, an accommodation is a change that helps a student overcome or work around the disability. An accommodation can be something like the child is struggling to be able to read. So, an accommodation could be that the questions are read orally on a test, for instance. Modifications are going to be changes within how the child is being taught. So, for example, Blaine could complete every other question, odd questions on his homework assignment would be a modification because we're changing that work. As the IEP team goes through and identifies the needs and the services, please note that suspension is not an educational service and should never be used in an IEP. Now, families and their children have many rights under the federal laws. The families have a right to have their child assessed, to disagree with an evaluation, the IEP implementation programs, and the outcomes. They also have a right to be part of the team, which is very important. We want to make certain, once again, that it's family driven. We also want our families to understand that they have a right in helping to write an IEP and to also sit back and think about it, and also to change the world by changing the laws. Now, disagreements are inevitable in part because there are so many moving components to an IEP. If a family believes that their child rights have been violated because they're not receiving the right types of services, the family can ask for a procedure called due process. Now, the school must provide information on how to activate due process, but due process is not to be used lightly. Now, in most states, if a parent chooses not to sign an IEP at the conclusion of the IEP meeting, nothing will be implemented for 14 days to allow time for the families to review and to request changes if desired, or to even file due process hearing if needed. Now, if the family or the parent does not sign on the 15th day after the meeting, the services will be implemented unless this is the first IEP meeting. That's a little different, but any other meetings after that, it can be implemented after the 15th day. If a child or a youth is receiving special education services through an IEP, they must be reevaluated to determine if they still qualify or need special education and to address any new things that may arise. Now, this is no more than once a year unless the family or the school district agrees that one is needed. The family and the students will meet with an IEP team at least once per year to discuss progress and to include all new goals and related services to an IEP plan. Now, as far as Section 504 is concerned, Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 guarantees certain rights to people with disabilities. Named for its legislation, the 504 plan is a plan developed at the school level to customize a student's learning environment to meet this specific needs of a child. A 504 plan is intended for children with disabilities who do not meet the requirements of special education services through the IEP process. The plan identify accommodations a child with a disability needs to fully participate in a classroom setting. That way, the child can be successful with their peers. Now, according to the U.S. Department of Education, a child with a disability is defined as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that sequentially limits a major life activity, has a record of such an impairment, and or is regarded to having such an impairment. Now, the 504 plan is another way to establish necessary services for a student with special education needs. A 504 plan prohibits discrimination against any student with disabilities and guarantees them that free, appropriate public education, or FAPE, like what we talked about earlier. It also includes students who need accommodations but are not otherwise eligible for special education services under the IDEA. And here is at a glance what a 504 is. So, in order to be eligible for a 504 plan, you must have a physical or mental impairment, which sequentially limits one or more major life activities. Section 504 does not require a written plan, but it does require documentations of evaluations and accommodations. A 504 plan can describe the accommodations that a school will provide. So here are some examples of accommodations with 504s. You can glance over those real quickly. The one that tends to stick out with parents a lot of times is going to be providing a reduction in that homework assignment. So let's talk about functional behavioral assessments. So functional behavioral assessment is a process for collecting information that will assist in developing an intervention plan for behaviors that interfere with the education of a child. The IDEA states that the IEP team will consider the use of a positive behavior intervention plan and supports and other strategies to address the behaviors in cases when students' behaviors impedes the learning of themselves or that of others. The positive behavior intervention plan is about learning more about the student's behavior, when that behavior is going to likely occur, and then, of course, putting in that plan to have that positive strategies in place to teach those new behaviors that we want them to be successful in learning. An IEP and a 504 are not the same. The needs of the student really should dictate which one is used. Now, going over the difference between an IEP and 504, so side-by-side comparisons on this slide. In this slide, we're going to see basic description of what an IEP and a 504 is. Both an IEP and a 504 are at no cost to parents. Okay, so that's important to know. An IEP provides individualized, specialized education and related services to meet the child's unique needs. Where where a 504 plan provides services and changes to the learning environment to enable a student be able to learn beside their peers. So, who is eligible for an IEP? Now, this is very important. You actually have to have both of these in order to qualify. So, a child has to have one of the 13 disabilities listed with IDEA. Now, the state of Tennessee does recognize 15 disabilities. So, the state of Tennessee recognizes 2 additional disabilities, which is functional delay and intellectually gifted. So, in the state of Tennessee, if you're a resident obtaining an IEP, you have 15 diagnoses. You have to qualify with one of those 15 diagnoses, and number 2 has to apply, which is the disability must affect the child's educational performance and or ability to learn and benefit from general education curriculum. The child must need specific instructions to make progress in school. Both of these have to happen in order to be eligible for an IEP. That's very important. A lot of times we see that a child does not qualify for an IEP, but will qualify for a 504. So here are the 504 requirements. A child has to have a disability. Section 504 covers a wide range of different struggles within the school system. So once again, that's the reason why we see a lot of times the child may qualify for a 504, but not an IEP. Also, the disability must interfere with the child's ability to learn in a general education classroom. So that's the difference between the two. IEP, you've got to have the 2. With a 504, it is more relaxed. So families who are working with an IEP can request an IEE or an independent educational evaluation. Now, the school district does not have to agree to this. Families can have outside evaluations be completed at their cost. However, the school system does not have to give that much weight and merit. So I do want to make that clear that they can look at it, but it doesn't have to change their opinion. Now, families who are working with a 504 plan, unfortunately, cannot ask for an independent educational evaluation. Now, just like with the IEP, they can pay for outside evaluations to be conducted, but once again, the district does not have to give that much weight. Now, there are strict requirements on who participates in an IEP meeting. The caregiver of the child, parent, guardian, the child, depending on the age, a general education teacher, a special education teacher, school psychologist, or other specialists who will be interpreting evaluation results, and a district representative with authority over special education services. So once again, your principal, your vice principal tend to be the 2 that are the most popular in the meeting. Now, when it comes to a 504 plan, these rules are less specific. I have seen case holders and a parent. I have seen the principal and the parent. I've seen principals, teachers, the whole 9 yards in a 504 plan meeting. So it really just depends on what the parent has requested, what the school can accommodate for on that date, and if it's applicable. Okay, so it can be many different ways. So let's talk about what's in an IEP and a 504 plan. An IEP sets learning goals and describes the services that the school will provide in a written document. Some of the most important things in an IEP must include the present level of academic performance of the child, annual educational goals, and the services that the child will be receiving and the time in which the services will be held. Now, as far as a 504, that can be a little different. There is no standard when it comes to a 504. It doesn't have to be a written document. It can be a general plan including specific accommodations, supports and services for the child, and it can also name who will be providing those services. Other things that you may see in an IEP are going to be the accommodations, the modifications, how the child will participate in standardized testing, and how the child will be included in the general education classes and other activities. As far as a 504 plan, we may see the name of the person responsible for ensuring that plan is implemented, so such as a case holder. Within an IEP, the school must notify the family of any changes to the services or placement in writing before changes are to be made. This is called a prior written notice, or you'll see it as PWN as well. The notice is required when an IEP meeting or evaluations take place as well. Families also have what's called the stay put right to keep services in place while there's any disagreement about an IEP. Now, as far as a 504, when working under a 504 plan, the school must notify the family about an evaluation or a significant change in placement. Now, that's important, significant change in placement. Um, Now, notice they don't have to provide anything in writing, but a lot of times the schools will just naturally write something down. We see that more often than not. Now, both an IEP and a 504 requires written consent for caregivers in order to do any types of evaluation. And as far as an IEP is concerned, you do have to have written consent on file to provide IEP services. Now, like what we talked about before, sometimes disputes are inevitable. There's going to be something that is a problem. If it cannot be rectified within a regular IEP meeting, there's multiple ways to do resolution. There is mediation. There is filing a due process complaint, resolution sessions, civil right lawsuits, state complaints, and lawsuits. And then with a 504, you have mediation, alternative dispute resolution, impartial hearings, and complaints to the civil rights, and then lawsuits as well. Now, the IEP team must review the IEP at least once a year and do a reevaluation every 3 years. Now, as far as a 504, that's a little bit different. A 504 depends on the state. Generally, the consensus is they review yearly, reeval every 2 years. I'm sorry, every 3 years or as needed. Now, students receiving IEPs and 504s, once again, that's at no charge to those families. Now, the state does receive additional funding for students who have IEPs, but they do not receive additional funding for those students who have 504s. However, federal governments can take funding away from programs and schools that do not meet their legal duties to serve children with disabilities. Now, IDEA funds. So if your child has an IEP, under the IDEA. IED funds cannot be used to serve students who have 504 plans. Occasionally, and it's rare, but occasionally we do have students who have a 504 and have an IEP. You cannot have those meetings jointly together and use IDEA funds. Okay. Now you can have back-to-back meetings. So you can have an IEP meeting and then have a 504 meeting directly afterwards. And some or all of those people can be the same, but they can't be jointly done. Now, meetings are to be held in a location and time that is going to be convenient for the families. All meetings should be accommodating to the families with the purpose of keeping those families involved. Now, families should express what their needs are. So, if they can only get off on Tuesdays, they really need to be expressing what it is that they're needing. Also, when it comes to those families, once again, and having advocates or having additional supports, make certain that you're communicating with that school so that way they can have the right types of supports and accommodations for that meeting. Now, this is a great slide. I really like it a lot. It really does define what IEPs and 504s are all about. Here we have somebody who is asking all of these animals to take a test, and the test is to climb up the tree. Well, we know that only one of those is going to be able to climb up the tree. Even the bird doesn't stand a chance. Now, they can fly to the top of the tree, but they're going to have an extremely hard time being able to climb up a tree, and definitely not that goldfish, right? So these are some things that I want you to keep in mind is information should be given to the families on a reading level that they understand. If you do not understand something, please speak up and ask questions. Make certain that you're given examples if you don't understand something. One thing that I really did make certain to teach my children at an early age is to tell me, Mommy, I don't understand it. Explain it to me a different way. That is the best way for us to learn how to advocate for ourselves is by asking them to explain it in a different way because we don't understand it. Now, you have the right to know who will be attending your meeting and what that role is that they're providing. Now, ask questions. If you don't understand who is there and why they're there, please make certain that you're asking. Now, the families and students may call a recess to continue the meeting at any time. Meetings can be really emotional for families, which is completely understandable. Once again, I have to go through my own every single year, and every single year I can understand that emotion that comes with it. So understand that you can take a recess. Families should be told ahead of time, and they should also feel comfortable with asking for a recess or to even postpone the meeting into another day if they're just unable to continue with that meeting. A family support parent can be offered to assist those families in an IEP process as well. Now, the meeting should be open with introductions, and the family should be able to introduce themselves. In addition to, we should hear about the strengths of the students, and that should be highlighted. And parents should be able to speak about what they're seeing firsthand. Other things that we may see within an IEP meeting are on each component of the IEP. The family should be checked in on, see what their feelings are, see what their ideas are, see what their impressions on things are. In addition to, we should be checking in with the parents at every section to see if they like the goals and the objectives that are being put in place. Now, families should be offered a contact person when there's any evaluations or when an IEP process is going on. The person should be prepared to be able to answer questions, ask questions, check on the families when needed, follow up with the family. In addition to asking that all goals and objectives be re explained if necessary or even rewritten so that way we all understand that they make sense to everyone. Also, make certain that you're asking, how will something be done often? And assume nothing. Now, be purposeful in your meeting. Approach the IEP meeting like you would any other planning meeting. Understand the process, the intent, and the potential outcomes. Know what your rights and your responsibilities are. Gather information to participate as an informed member of that team. And also participate with good participation and communication skills is very key in this. Now, with that being said, do not lose your cool. It is very hard when we are in a heightened state of emotions not to lose our cool, because we have said something 1,000 times and we don't feel like we're being heard, right? So it is very hard, but don't lose your cool. And please, whatever you do, do not threaten a lawsuit. Depending on what the issues are and what the situation is, you may be able to do other things like negotiate, file a complaint with the state, request mediation, but litigation is going to be your last resource. Now, an IEP meetings are often a very emotional time. The school has to stand by really strict rules and regulations, right? And at the same time, families may disagree with what those decisions or the direction is that the IEP team is going. Don't get discouraged. Ask for a break. Call a friend if you need to, right? Allow yourself to feel those feelings. Stop, come back to it another day. It is not going to hurt for us to stop the meeting and to have it rescheduled for another date, especially if we feel like something's lacking and we're just unable to process through and communicate as a team. Now, some families hope that their child does poorly on testing, so that way the child is able to receive that much needed help, right? Families may encourage the school to do testing at times when they know that the student is going to perform poorly. One thing to keep in mind is you want the testing to be done in the most normalized environment as possible for the child. The testing should highlight the issues and concerns that we're having with the student in a normal daily environment in that school day. If it is not done that way, what could end up happening is that we're left with services or supports that don't really benefit or fit the need of that child. So it's very important that we're getting the correct type of data. Now, an IEP or a 504, you want to make certain that you're discussing those outside environments outside of that classroom, playgrounds, lunchrooms, buses, extracurricular activities. These are the places where it is not as structured and we tend to have more problems with behaviors and issues. Okay. It is very important that we're discussing what those environments look like and making certain that we're putting a plan of action into place to support those children. Now, special conditions for environments must be in an IEP meeting or an IEP in order for them to occur. Okay. So if additional assistance is needing during lunchtime, it has to be in an IEP in order for supports to be given. Now, an IEP and placement meetings, mediation meetings, due process resolutions, all of these things can be held by conference, so telephone conference, or by video conference, so by Google, Zoom. So it doesn't have to be in person. They can accommodate with a phone conference or by using a virtual form. So here are some great resources for you. We've got the Department of Education here. In addition to, we've got IDEA, Rights Law. Now, that is a fantastic website for you to look up special education laws. And then, of course, we've got the Special Education Guide as well. Now, I will be sending out an hand booklet as well that goes over more in depth about accommodations, modifications, how to write a modification or a goal, all of those things. Now, here is our information for Tennessee Voices. So you can go online if you need to make a referral. You can do a self referral to tnvoices.org. You'll use the drop down box to select 504 IEP. Advocacy, we help to support in those realms. Also, in your procedural safeguard, you should receive it at every meeting that you have with an IEP. And it also has our information in the back as well as some more resources. Now, here's my contact information. Again, my name is Sabrina Moore, and I do work with Tennessee Voices. And we do have a QR code up there. I'm also going to drop a link in the chat box as well. If you guys would take a few moments to um, fill out this survey for me. This is just a survey, so that way we can continue to provide trainings for free to all of our Tennessee residents. I would greatly appreciate it. This really helps us to understand also what other types of trainings you would like to see in the future and how we can better our trainings. So we would love to get your feedback on that. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a moment. I'm going to put in my contact information. And excuse me, I'm working on two different computer screens here.
Well, Sabrina, while you're doing that, I'm going to kind of
Absolutely.
talk about a couple of things. I just wanted to remind you again, too, that just like Sabrina was talking about, we definitely do offer, and you do have the opportunity that if you need a moment, even if it's in the meeting, I always tell parents, you can certainly ask for 5 minutes. I have done that myself many times for parents, and that's never been something that anybody has turned us down. Also, know that you can invite me to meetings as well, or to prepare you for a meeting, or get kind of talk about things afterwards. I get as involved or not as families want us to. In a 504 for Knox County, generally you usually have you usually have the teacher, you usually have the vice principal, whatever your grade level principal is, just so you kind of know those things. If you do an outside evaluation, what I always explain to parents is that may be very valuable to you, because the testing that we do at Knox County and all the schools is they're really just looking to see if your child qualifies for services. So a lot of people will say to me, Sue, I really want to know what kind of learning disability my child has. The testing that we do doesn't really talk about whether or not your child is dyslexic. All it will really say is we can see these symptoms and it's possible, but it doesn't confirm or deny that they have a specific learning disability like that. It just looks at what the actual testing is. So I want to kind of get that information out there. So I'm going to open it up for questions, and I know that Sabrina has a couple already showing up in the box. Do you want me to read them, or can you see them,
No.
Sabrina?
Yes, I can see them.
Okay.
So one says, once an IEP is placed, what information should we expect to receive in terms of updates? So JR, are you asking for like a timeline of when you'll receive that information? I want to make certain I'm getting clarity.
Yeah, I'm more asking about like timing of revisiting the IEP updates on progress, like if part of the IEP is X number of sessions with this resource, is there transparency on when those are taking place?
Yes, good question. So there are guidelines for certain things to be done. So, for instance, for the first initial evaluation, it is a 60-day process. And then from there, you have 30 days in order to complete the IEP. So, 60 days for the evaluation Then in that 30 days after the evaluation, you're going to have your meeting and you're going to discuss the evaluation and you're going to develop an IEP. All assessments, unless they're rushed by the local district, all assessments typically take about 60 days. Sometimes
Oh, right.
sooner, once
Yeah,
again, depending on that.
those have already been done. I'm just asking about like following through with what's been defined in the IEP in terms of
Sure.
services.
That's immediately. So, depending on what day it is or what time it is, if you have made changes to that IEP, that should be taken care of the very next day, or there should be a timeline established. So, say for instance, if a child, I had a child who needed a duvet for cleanliness, and the school was willing to take on that accommodation. And but they had to order it. But it was during COVID. It was hard to get those types of equipment. So there was a timeline that was set of about 2 weeks in order to order it, install it, and those sorts of things. So sometimes there are timelines, but getting clarity is going to be the best way to advocate for your child and asking, what does that look like and what can we expect? Does that help?
Um, Not quite. And maybe I didn't phrase my question exactly, but let's say in my child's IEP, they're entitled to like a number of sessions with a resource at the school. Like, what is the follow up in terms of, hey, we've done, X number of sessions now, this is complete. I'm just not sure like what the communication lines are in terms of making sure the terms of the IEP are fulfilled.
For instance, if there is a educational goal and it says that they will have 80% mastery on a goal, um, that may not be something that is reevaluated or looked at until the next year or the next IEP meeting. It really kind of depends on what it is, and I hate for you to have to explain further. And I'd be happy to have more of a sidebar conversation with you to get to what exactly it is to make a better educated guess on what that timeline looks like for you.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's see. Okay, good question. So it says, hi, my child is in their first year of IEP, and I would like to know if my child would lose their place if we decided to homeschool, withdraw from the public school system next year. So that was part of it. So the answer to that would be yes, but depending on what services there are, say for speech, occupational therapy, those sorts of things, if that child received that type of service, then that service could possibly go into a specialized IEP for homeschool. Homebound and homeschool are two different things. In Knox County, and Miss Sue may be able to explain a little bit more on how Knox County provides that service. It kind of depends on the county, but certain things you can utilize an IEP with homeschool services.
What I would encourage you to do, and she's right, I believe what you're talking about is specifically homeschooling. And so some of those services can be provided, but I'd also encourage you to continue with your IEP meetings because the IEP as it's written is only good for that school year. So you can continue to have those meetings and keep them updated in case you want to either return back to school or continue with specific services that you're receiving.
And, don't be surprised if going back into the school system, say you homeschooled for a year, found out that it just wasn't something that you guys could do, or they were missing socialization. I had homeschooled my own son, and that was one thing that I just could not accommodate for, was the amount of socialization that he wanted. So when going into the school system from a homeschool setting, there is testing involved depending on what types of courses of material you are utilizing. So please be sure that you're looking at accredited schools versus independent homeschooling. That's going to make a big difference on going back into the school system and where placement may be for grade.
And I'm sorry, I didn't read the next part, but
Sure.
the other part is if you're going to come back to a school, you would go to whatever you're zoned for. So if you were zoned for, I'm just going to make something up, Carnes, then that's where you would go to re-enroll.
Yeah, these are some great questions. Any other questions? Okay, so our next one is, what if services are stated in an IEP, but those services aren't being provided at a significantly lower amount than the IEP? That's when we definitely want to call for an IEP meeting to discuss our concerns. We can also put our concerns in writing in email form to the team to let them know on the reason why we're calling for an IEP meeting, and to discuss those concerns when we get to the IEP meeting, to see what it is that we're seeing versus what it is they're providing, and see if we can come to some agreement on what that's supposed to look like and get better clarity. Of course, if at any time you feel that services are not adequate or not being provided, you can always ask for due process. Once again, that's one of the things that we wait till a little bit later. We see if we can't get communication going. We see if we can't get things to where they need to be first before we look at due process. But you could potentially do due process if you felt that services are not being provided. All right. How to know if an IEP accommodation request is reasonable? One example, oh, sorry, I had two to pop in at once. One example, my son has a hard time writing his thoughts when composing an essay or research paper. Is it reasonable to ask IEP to provide someone to write down or type for him where he would? Yeah, so good question. It depends on the individual. So, for instance, there are some concerns with individuals where they may not have the muscle ability to perform certain tasks. I've had some children with different types of muscle or bone disorders that have caused problems with handwriting and those sorts of things. So there have been different unique steps that we have taken. One of those is talk to text. They wouldn't count off for spelling when it was talk to text, because as we know, sometimes that doesn't work well. But there were certain things that could be requested. Is it a reasonable accommodation? It depends on the child itself and that need. There could be other workarounds that we may not have discussed, but having an open line of communication with that team, state the problem, and then state, here's the concern that I have. How are we going to address it? And then see what they can come up with. A lot of times really does help us as parents to know what it is that they can provide within that school setting. Does that help?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. You're welcome. So another one is, so my daughter attends and she is just getting her IEP and is in the 5th grade. So she will be going into middle school. So I definitely want to make sure it stays with her. I was told sometimes it's try to get. Okay, Miss Cindy, let me make certain that I'm understanding. Are you concerned that it may not travel with her when she goes into middle school? Is that my understanding?
That is correct. So
Okay.
I was told by her after school mentor, she was like, just make sure, because I've seen children go into middle school and they'll say, oh, like they're doing so great, like they're meeting the goals, da da da. They'll get over into middle school, they'll hit a new level of difficulty, and then they need it. And like she has a student now that's went into high school, lost it in middle school. Her mom's trying to still get it back, and she's failing classes and not getting the accommodations she needed because she was kind of like, I guess, in reference, like she felt like she was meeting her goals, kind of like, oh, talked out of it. And I know, of course, you guys have standards and policies and procedures that you have to go by, of course, but I'm just, I want to make sure it stays with her, because we've been at Beaumont for quite some time, and she just received it actually here
Okay.
in the last semester, and we've had a meeting, a couple meetings, I think, actually, where we actually signed everything, me and Dad, and got everything finished. And so I just want to make sure that that stays with her, because she has been doing better with these accommodations, with the disability that she has.
That is a very great question. So, an IEP stays with a child regardless of what county, state, or school that they go to. Now, a reevaluation or a team coming back together once you've reestablished somewhere else is very important. So, in your particular case, going into middle school, what I would suggest is one of two different ways of looking at it, and Miss Sue may be able to give better clarity on this specific location. But typically, what we tell parents is right close to the end of the year, like that month of communicating with the school. Typically, they already do this for us, but just being proactive. Um, Communicating with the school, letting them know, hey, I would like to get a transition plan into place to help to support. Can we have a conversation with the IEP team now and the potential IEP team for the next school? And then having that conversation, collaborating together to see what it is in supports that we can put in on day one that's going to help support that individual. And you can do that like the month before school is out on your 5th grade year, or you can do it like a week or two before school starts within that first month. It is typically when we see that happen. Some schools, once again, are very proactive and they already have a transition plan in place to help support the needs of that individual going into that next school year or into that next school. Miss Sue,
I
how do you
do.
guys normally?
We call them bump up meetings kind of inside, and usually they start happening about March. But I always tell parents you are always welcome to request a meeting. March is kind of the time that those happen. There's also usually a day that the students can go to the middle schools. They get on the bus and they actually go and visit the middle schools. If you have some concerns that maybe they won't get what they need from that kind of visit, because it's basically taking a lot of young children over to a school and kind of do a tour, I always tell parents that we can schedule for something else. A great time that might be for a kid that gets overstimulated would be during the summer months. The schools are open until about 12 o'clock usually on Wednesdays. So I always encourage families to be looking towards the transition time, especially when you're talking about middle school, because that is a big jump.
Yes, ma'am. Okay. And going over to middle school, and then just making sure, like, if they want it, so I guess if they want to set something up in that regard, that they could.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I have one more question real fast.
Sure.
I just want to ask, like, I know, in like I don't think this starts until middle school. I know there's a lot of courses that children are allowed to take, and this is a big jump because obviously she's a fifth grader. But just thinking ahead into the future, courses that are offered through the community college, where once they're finished with high school, they basically almost like if they really apply themselves, are finished with that 2-year degree. If they, of course, there are going to be barriers if a child already has an IEP, but with that being said, if they take a course and it's like community college or something, if they qualify for that, or if they can and they want to um, advance that, so they'll have those better, a little bit kind of jump after they're finished with high school. Are they allowed to use their accommodations there as well?
They are in some certain circumstances. So I would communicate with the local college that you're looking at. They will have an office. Every one of their offices are something different. So I apologize for not having the correct term, but that from what I've seen, it varies um, in each area of what they're called. But they do have an office that will support IEPs and 504 accommodations, and they would be able to review that with you and let you know which accommodations that they could accommodate for.
Okay, okay. I just wanted to check because I myself
Sure.
had my one and I got a degree later in life, and I was given my accommodations because I work with both rehab because I do have a learning disability.
Yes, ma'am. Great question.
If you're
That's
talking
a
about
fantastic one.
Mississippi or a place like that, it's the Office of Disabilities that can help you with those things.
Okay, okay. It's been a while since I've been, so I was thinking it was that, but I wasn't sure. Thank you, Miss Sue. Thank you,
Thank
Mr.
you, Miss Sue. Yes, ma'am. You're welcome, Miss Cindy. So I'm going to address one more question and then I apologize. I do have another meeting that I have to jump in for, but I did put my contact information in the chat box. Please feel free to communicate with me on any questions that we don't get to today. Miss Peggy had stated that she wanted to give clarity on her situation and wanted to know if the child would be reevaluated when they come back into the public school system. If the third year of the IEP since we homeschool the second year. So yes, the answer is yes, they would be reevaluated, Miss Peggy. Did that help with clarity, Miss Peggy?
Uh, what I mean reevaluated, it means do they need to be reevaluated for the qualification of IEP
Yes,
or
ma'am. Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
So
They
to do,
would. In most cases. Now, Knox may be a little different, but in the majority of cases, they are going to need to be reevaluated in order to seek special education services.
okay, thank
We
you.
would reevaluate all students every 3 years, and we update the IEPs every year. So more than likely, if it's been 3 years since they've been evaluated last, they would still do the evaluation. Now, how deep that evaluation goes depends on what information, what their qualifications are. So they may look at if they say have a learning disability and they can see that that's still pretty evident, they probably wouldn't do it as deep of an evaluation as if it was for some other issue.
Thank you.
Okay,
Perfect.
well,
Okay, guys.
we are a little past 1 o'clock. Thank you guys for hanging in there and thank you for those great questions. We really appreciate it. We are going to be doing another training. I'm not exactly sure of which training we're going to have, so I'm going to hold on to that, but it will be in our newsletter and we'll be sending flyers out for you to know when that will be. It will be on Monday. It will be 12 o'clock. It'll probably be either the second or third Monday, but I haven't gotten that completely tied down yet. So stay tuned. We'll get some more of those things. And Sabrina, I really appreciate you coming over. It's been many, many years, but I actually used to work for Tennessee Voices. So I'm always happy to see some of my colleagues. So it was a pleasure
Thank
for you to come and talk with us today.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Thank you guys so much for having me.
Have a wonderful afternoon, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye, guys.